Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much. My name is Peter Seligman, and I'm just happy to be able to share a screen and this opportunity with three extraordinary people. I'd also like just to start out by acknowledging the Global Philanthropy Forum for inviting us to discuss community responses to climate threats. And I, of course, want to acknowledge each of you who are participating for your generosity and for your altruism, for your concern. Today, we will have this opportunity to speak with Hindu, Nathaniel, and Tessa. These are three extraordinary human beings, all of whom have explored, designed, and delivered on breakthrough ideas for community empowerment in the face of climate catastrophe. Hindu Ibrahim is an extraordinary woman from Chad. She's an indigenous leader with a strong voice that's heard globally. She is also one of the local leaders in Chad who is forcefully and brilliantly supported her communities in the face of environment and climate tragedy. And so, Hindu, it's wonderful to see you. I'm honored that you are also a board member of Conservation International. Nathaniel Stennett has been as successful as anyone in inspiring environmentalists to actually vote. And what you're going to hear from Nat is pretty shocking in terms of the differential between the heart of people and their willingness to use the power of the vote to transform the state of the United States of America. And Tessa Khan is a human rights lawyer. She is a leader of a climate litigation initiative, a leader of Agenda Foundation, and has really paved the way for precedent-setting social justice commitments in the Netherlands. My name, Peter Seligman. I've been involved in the environmental movement for many, many decades, really focusing on that simple concept that humanity needs nature to thrive. In 2017, I stepped down from Conservation International and launched a new organization with a very singular commitment, which is how I became such close friends with Hindu, of working in solidarity with Indigenous peoples to secure their self-determined commitments for their culture and their territories. And just as kind of an opening, I want to just highlight why we focus on Indigenous peoples and why I have made such a deep personal commitment there. Indigenous peoples have been assaulted by Western society since the 15th century. Their language, cultures, lives have been subjected to a genocide, which has morphed into ecocide. Yet these communities control today 1/3 of the earth, with 80% of the global biodiversity and 1/3 of the above ground carbon. Their lives, as well as all of our lives, depend upon their continued guardianship of these territories. And most significantly, these cultures share something that I hope that we all humans can grasp, which is the concept of reciprocity, that human beings and non-human beings are all interconnected. And these communities still retain deep knowledge of how the earth operates. If we listen to them, we can learn a lot. So today, just setting the platform for our conversation, we all recognize that it is in our enlightened self-interest to address the immediate and dangerous threats posed by climate change. The dramatic impact of climate change has already radically impacted food and water security of millions of people, resulting in conflicts between communities over scarce resources, and also resulting in forced migrations from communities as they search for safety and security for their families. We also know that the most common pixel on the planet Earth is the community. Thousands of communities, hundreds of thousands of communities inhabit every single part of the habitable pieces of this earth. And we know that within every single one of those communities, the most powerful force, probably the most powerful force on the planet Earth, is the commitment of parents to children. So we live in a world when you know that communities and families are striving for their own security and safety, yet much of our world is governed by bureaucracy. And bureaucracy reigns, and governments, despite their awareness of the challenges which are posed by climate transition, are incapable of rapidly changing the status quo. People who are privileged do not want to risk the change, as these changes pose a threat to their own security. And the result is that those communities that do not have are endangered and in harm's way. Fortunately, today, social media has brought so many of these communities together. So there is a voice today saying we need to act, allowing for shared ideas, shared experiences, and shared voice. So although we see an increase in disparity, injustice, and instability, I believe we also see opportunities for solutions. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. What are the opportunities for solutions that emerge from organizations and from communities that can actually be transformative? Because when we look at the earth, we think about the head in the sky. It's always the big power. But the feet in the mud, the communities, is what stimulates and drives action. And that's what these three great leaders focus on. So just to begin, I'd like to start with you, Tessa. First, thank you so much calling in from London. Thank you so much for being here and for being willing to share the work that you've been doing, first as a human rights lawyer and now as a litigator and a designer of strategy. Please, could you describe what you're doing today and the way that your work is benefiting communities, how your engagement with these communities guides your efforts, and in particular, let's start with what made you realize that litigation is a very powerful tool for holding governments accountable for climate change. Tessa.
Thank you, Peter. It's such a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I'm so grateful to be with you all, and it's a real privilege to share a virtual platform with people like Hindu and Nathaniel. So thank you again. So I guess I should say from the very beginning that I, of course, as a lawyer by training and by practice, have a bias towards litigation. And I think in the human rights world in particular, the kind of community of us who have been fighting to advance the enjoyment of human rights, litigation has proved to be a really powerful tool in some of the key struggles for economic and social and political justice. And of course, in the US, there's a very rich history of litigation being used, key court cases that have helped to advance the civil rights movement, but equally in countries like South Africa and India, really in all countries that have the rule of law and some kind of legal protection of rights, litigation has often played an important role in advancing that agenda. But as far as climate litigation goes, so in 2015, I was working in Asia with the women's movements there, doing some legal advocacy around the negotiation of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And my organization was also doing some work around the Paris Agreement as well. And I was really reflecting over the course of the year on how the year was going to culminate in these two new agreements with a whole new set of commitments that governments would make to take sustainable development and the climate crisis seriously. But that wouldn't be new. That would really just be the latest in a series of kind of an accumulation over decades of international agreements and decisions. I mean, in the climate change space, there was the original Climate Change Treaty in 1992. Governments meet annually at the COPs to negotiate new decisions, and yet so little seems to change on the ground. There's so little accountability, in my view, for all of those promises. And so it was kind of I was in that sort of headspace when I heard about this court case in the Netherlands that was brought by an organisation called the Agenda Foundation against the Dutch government. And they were basically suing the government for not having fulfilled all of those promises. And they were using local, Dutch laws to really crystallise those commitments and to say to the court that the court should be ordering the government to actually reduce emissions in line with the objectives of the UN climate treaties. And I think to the surprise of even the Dutch lawyers, the court agreed with them. And that was kind of headline news. It was in the New York Times and the BBC. And it really landed, I think, like a bit of a grenade. I mean, a good grenade in terms of illustrating that maybe there was this new avenue of accountability that we hadn't yet invested enough time and thinking in. And that was how to use local legal frameworks and local legal institutions to hold governments accountable. And so I more or less cold called the Dutch legal team and quit my job and offered to join them and to help them to export their thinking and their strategy to the many other countries that I knew also needed that kind of strategy to force governments to do what we know is necessary and what governments themselves have accepted is necessary. So that was really the beginning of the Climate Litigation Network, and we've subsequently been working with lawyers and campaigners and activists in different countries who are seeking to get some real accountability for inaction, comprehensive inaction on the climate crisis. And, you know, these cases are being brought on behalf of Indigenous communities, on behalf of children, on behalf of all of the frontline groups who are at the kind of pointy end of the climate crisis at the moment. So I think that, that really, to me, demonstrated the power of litigation in this context.
Let me just ask you a follow-up question. You win a lawsuit. The Dutch government is forced to live up to the obligations to their commitment. Do they have the capability? Do they have the strategy and the plan in place that actually allows them to do that, where they are actually able to do what they promised? Or because that seems like the essential next step is, okay, I've got to do it. What do I do? Yeah.
I mean, I'm really glad that you asked that, Peter, because I think that's such an important part of any litigation strategy is how do we actually make sure that whatever comes out in court translates into real change, on the ground, so to speak. And I think that with climate change, governments have known for decades actually what they need to do. They've had the resources to do it. They just haven't prioritized it. And I think the way that governments around the world have responded to the COVID-19 crisis is really evidence that when they put their minds to it, they can mobilize the resources. Federal banks can pump trillions of dollars into the economy. We can make the sorts of structural economy-wide changes that we need to when we want to prioritize an issue. And so the Dutch government did make the emissions cuts that it was ordered to do. So that was a 25% reduction in emissions by the end of 2020 compared to 1990 levels. And this year, the Dutch government announced that it was going to phase out coal-fired power capacity by 75%. In the Netherlands, it pumped €3 billion into other emissions reductions measures. So that's really made all the difference. And I think the other great thing about litigation is that it can, because it's a pretty dramatic tactic to take your government to court. So it can focus a lot of media attention on the issue of climate change. And from 2015, when the first decision was announced by a Dutch court, it led to so much visibility of climate change as an issue that even though the government was still appealing the decision, the Dutch parliament voted to phase out coal-fired power as soon as possible. The Netherlands passed a new Climate Change Act, and people really attribute that to the litigation and the fact that it put climate change on the agenda and put the government in the hot seat about it in a way that no one else had managed to do.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I mean, thank you not only for the answer, but more importantly, thank you for quitting your job and doing this. That's a big deal. So let me switch over to you, Nat, and Tess. I'm looking forward to kind of continuing this. I have other questions. I'd like to know how we export that to other countries as well. But Nat, we talked earlier, and you gave, what you've been working on is really, how do you stimulate environmentalists to vote? And that what you said was you're looking at data and you're looking at behavioral change. Could you share with everyone present these extraordinary statistics that you just shared with us about the percentage of environmentalists who are concerned with climate and are actually not going to the polls and voting, and what you're doing about it? You're on mute.
Absolutely, Peter. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you. So, yes, it's so crucially important to understand that, at least in the United States, but we have some reason to believe in other countries as well, the environmental movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout or behavioral problem. And it's certainly the case in American electoral politics. And so although turnout rates vary from election to election, you have local elections, you have midterm elections, you have presidential elections, people who prioritize climate and the environment consistently vote less often than the average American. And so I'll give you an example. In the 2016 presidential election, so this is Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, 69% of registered voters voted. 69%. But only 50% of environmentalists turned out to vote. So a huge, huge gap. 19 percentage points below the average. And the average wasn't that good either. Yeah. And what that equated to in real numbers is there were 10.1 million already registered to vote super environmentalists who just sat at home during the 2016 presidential election. 10.1 million of them in an election that was decided by 77,000 votes across 3 states. And so what we do with the Environmental Voter Project is we bypass a lot of the really hard, expensive stuff that a lot of environmental nonprofits do, which is trying to change opinions and trying to change minds. Boy, is it hard these days to change someone's mind about climate change. Instead, we use data science to find the people who are already with us, to find the people who care so deeply about climate and the environment that it's quite literally their number one priority. Yet they aren't voting. And then we don't need to change their minds or opinions about anything. Then we can do something that's a little bit easier. We can make a behavioral play and just try to nudge them into being better voters. And the way that we do that is completely apolitical. We don't talk about candidates. We don't even talk about climate or the environment. We're this weird environmental nonprofit that never even talks about the environment. Instead, we use little behavioral psychology tricks like peer pressure and social pressure and appealing to the communal norms that people might buy into to try to nudge them into being better versions of themselves. And it can pretty dramatically increase turnout, not only in specific one-off elections, but more importantly, it has a cumulative impact over time. Because as many of the listeners are probably aware, not only in the United States, but across the world, federal governments aren't the only important policymakers that we need to deal with here. It's also local and state governments. I mean, big city mayors can save the planet. State governments can save the planet. But what all of them have in common, at least in democracies with fairly consistent rule of law, is they need to win elections. They need to respond to what voters want, or else simple arithmetic just isn't going to give them enough votes to win. And so what we do with the Environmental Voter Project is just try to dramatically increase the number of environmentalists who vote.
So are you targeting swing states?
No, what we're doing is we find states that have disproportionately large populations of these non-voting environmentalists, such that if we do our job, if we consistently increase turnout every local, state, federal, primary, general, special election, we will pretty soon have a transformative impact on the electorate for every election. Now, many of them happen to be swing states. Many of the states that we're working in are, Florida, Pennsylvania, Arizona, North Carolina. But we're not there because they're swing states. Because the truth is, sometimes a swing state can be important for election X, but then 3 months later, it's not important for election Y. So what we want to do is we go into a community, we find the non-voting environmentalists there, and then whenever they have an election, even if it's for library trustee or dog catcher, we use it as a behavioral intervention opportunity to turn them into more consistent voters. Because, surprise, surprise, if you're trying to change someone's behavior, you can't just talk to them every 2 or 4 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. Like, That's not how you change someone's eating habits. That's not how you change someone's exercise habits. And it's also not how you change their voting habits. And so we really live in these communities, and we find all the non-voting environmentalists, and we try to nudge them into becoming more consistent voters whenever they have an election, and not just these big presidential races.
So let me ask you a question as a follow-up. How do you evaluate your success? I mean, are you a massive organization and how many different communities? Are there specific elections that you then say we have been able to turn out more voters? You know, what's the metric so that you can see if you're actually having the impact that you wish to have?
It's a great question. So first, yes, we are, although we are a young organization at the Environmental Voter Project, we are increasingly massive. We're working in 12 states. We have over 4,600 volunteers who help us contact our voters with completely nonpartisan, apolitical messaging. And we measure our impact in two ways. The first is on an election to election basis, we submit our work to randomized control trials, which very quickly means the following. Let's say we identify 1 million non-voting environmentalists in Florida. What we do not do is immediately start texting and calling and sending digital ads and direct mail to all 1 million of them. Instead, before we talk to a single one, we randomly remove 20% and hold them aside in a control group, and we never talk to them. Then the remaining 80%, those are the people who get our behavioral science-informed messaging. Then what happens, and this is such a crucially important thing to understand, not only about the United States, but many democracies around the world, is this. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is actually public record. What elections you show up in is public record. So then what happens, Peter, is after the election, we can look up and see how many people voted in our treatment group and how many people voted in our control group, and compare turnout in both groups. And as long as it was a truly random process and the numbers are big enough, that allows us to isolate the impact that we were solely responsible for while isolating all the other variables. And so as an example, in the 2018 midterm elections in our 6 states, we're now in 12 states, but we were in 6 states back then, we were solely responsible for increasing turnout 2.7 percentage points over the control group. And that might not sound like a lot to you, but ask Hillary Clinton how big a deal 2.7% is. Like, it's a big number in this business. Yeah. And then finally, very quickly, the second metric is we measure graduates. We measure how many people do we turn from non-voters into consistent super voters who vote in local, state, and federal elections. And by the end of 2019, just our 3rd year, we had already graduated 253,000 people out of our program.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. I love it. I wish you were just really intensely focusing on the swing states right now, to be honest. But that's just like,
we're in a lot of them. We're in a lot of them.
Okay. Thank you so much. And congratulations. It's really exciting if you think about the opportunity to actually take advantage of the power that every individual has, right? To vote, to use the power of your purchasing so you can send messages to the corporate world as to what you will consume, what you will eat, how you will live, you know, and then also to really establish, you know, what are the core values that we actually have to embrace. And I want to shift, Hindu, to you, because you are well, first, you're a dear friend, and secondly, you are an inspiration. And, you know, as I stated in my introductory comments, you know, the colonization process that came out of Europe in around 1453, when the papal bull, basically the Pope basically said, you know, that commandment, thou shalt not kill, it only applies to Christians. Anybody else, you can take what they got, we'll split it 50-50. And there was a colonization process that spread all across the world. What has really struck me as extraordinary has been the resilience of indigenous peoples and their determination to retain their core culture as well as their territory. And the other piece that really jumps out as I've been learning is, if I look at communities that understand how the earth operates, it's the indigenous peoples whose cultures have been shaped by that place. And I've listened to you before kind of describe in your own community, this relationship between your culture and your place and what you know and your knowledge. And I wonder if you could just kind of share with the people that are listening who are not familiar with that kind of deep-rooted connection between place and culture, if you could touch upon that, and then go into the role that indigenous peoples can play in actually a transformation of how we care for large parts of this planet Earth.
Sure. Thank you very much, Peter. It's really a great pleasure to be with you in this panel. And of course, I enjoy listening Tessa and Nathaniel. I think this global work, it's really matter to help also indigenous people doing from the ground. Yes, from my community, I'm coming from a Bororo pastoralist communities who are a nomadic peoples. And as you know, just to confirm, my people live across 5 countries. We do not think about the border. The border is not matter for us because the land is matter for us. So my own peoples are living between Chad, Cameroon, Nigeria, Central African Republic. And when I say my people, it is not only like saying Bororo peoples, but it is my direct relative. I can have my direct cousin in all those 5 countries, coming from my father's side or my mother's side. So that means how we are diverse in our ecosystem, and our life is linked with this environment where we are living on it. And when you look at the map of those 5 countries, they are between desert and tropical forests. And that means we are following the rain in our daily life, in our entire life. So when it is a rainy season, we know exactly where we have to be. When it is a dry season, we know exactly where we have to be. And to give you the example on it, it is about our culture, about our identity. So for the century of years, we live on those environments and we know it better. When you take like a Western knowledge, they can take all our region have like 3 seasons. They say dry season, cold season, and rain season. That's it. And when you come to my community and you take just to like chat without going through others, the season that we have depend from the ecosystem where we live. The communities that living around Lake Chad, and I know that many of the audience understand about the Lake Chad that's shrinking from 25,000 kilometers squares to 2,000. So 90% of the lake disappears, just evaporated on 50 years only. So the people who live around this place, we have 5 seasons. And when you move from the center to the tropical forest in the south, we have 7 seasons. So it is not only like calling, we do have the season and then like 4 seasons in Europe and counting from 21st of September is the summer entering. No. So for us, it depends from the understanding of the nature. Each season have his specific knowledge and a specific information that coming. Either from the start, from the wind, from the cloud, from the birds migrations, from the flowers that forming. So it helps us to understand which kind of season we have. And it helps us to move from one place to another one, north to south or south to north. So that's how deep our knowledge and culture are linked to our environment beyond the frontiers that just come with the colonization.
And Hindu, that is a kind of a profound relationship with the earth. And clearly, most of Western society, but really most societies do not still have that deep relationship and understanding. What really has struck me has been this emerging interconnectedness and connection between indigenous peoples around the world. where you're no longer isolated, but you're connected. And you have been really working in that connection with many, many other cultures and communities. Is there a sense of hopefulness amongst those communities because your voices are coming together? What do you see as kind of the movement forward of this emerging power of Indigenous voices and Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, this is really the light I'm having also, linking up with my other brothers and sisters, Indigenous peoples across the globe. And as you already said in your introduction, we are keeping the 80% of the world biodiversity. So that means we are living in all this world ecosystem, from desert to the savannas, from glaciers to the tropical forest, from the mountain to the oasis. So all the different ecosystem islands, we are living on this one. And what put us together, because we have one thing in common. We all depend from the nature, and we know that we depend from this earth, and we have a duty to respect those land territories and resources. So it doesn't matter that we do not speak the same language, like English, Spanish, or whatever. We speak our mother tongue, but we know we connect. Immediately we connect. I share with you the example that when I went to Paraguay, so we went for the visit. I was through Brazil, and then I crossed the river. I went to the Paraguay. I went to the very remote indigenous communities living among themselves. They have only like one school. They have one canteen for eating for all the peoples. And when they saw me and I started just talking with them and someone is translated, all of them come surrounding me. And all the babies just like touching me. Not they saw like you didn't come, you are not from this culture, you do not wear our same clothes. Just so we feel this connection immediately. Why? Because we have the same language. Our language is the relation we have with our Mother Earth. And if the movement is growing, is giving me optimistic, I say yes. That's one of the power we are having. We are growing up this power. And how we are growing it up. I give you the example also during this COVID. Even we do not see each other physically, because otherwise we meet at the international conferences. So we start having a webinar among ourselves and try to discuss this issue, what is happening among ourselves. And it's change our strategy. How like the indigenous communities who are in Alaska, I get in touch with them just through a webinar, and others from Ecuador in Amazon, and myself, we discuss about how we are isolating our elders, how we are isolating our communities, how we are keeping them. So this movement, even with this crisis, we are growing up and having the same voice to face it together. So that gives me more optimistic. And the last one, it's like organization like Neatero, like Conservation International, who are like big organization thinking about conservation, but we do have something who growing up from it, where it's called Neatero, who is thinking about the local, very local, thinking about the indigenous, and understanding what we are doing, what we are saying, what we are claiming for. And also not just to give you a tip, of course you are my best friend, but just to say the reality on you. You said at the beginning, you think how indigenous people are marginalized and you are fighting for our right, and not you are saying it for the TV, but you are doing it. I saw it by my eyes physically, how you are caring. So if we have this kind of support and we come together ourselves, I think the hope is obvious there.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Hindu. I would just add, first of all, I appreciate all your kind words. One of the things that I have learned, is that for the environmental community and the indigenous rights community to come together, there has to be a thoughtful process of acknowledgement of the impact of colonization on indigenous peoples. It's in other words, we that have been involved in the environmental movement need to think about the acknowledgement, about the reparation, and about the mutual forgiveness that's involved. And what I've been saying to my friends who are in the environmental movement is that if you're going to work with Indigenous peoples, the starting point is acknowledgement of their rights of Indigenous people, acknowledgement of the right of self-governance. And from there, you can build a trusted relationship. And what we have learned at Neotero is that our board is over 50% Indigenous. Our staff is 60% Indigenous. We have to be polycultural and be a bridging organization and learn to listen and make choices that are a collective and collaborative agreement. It's a learning experience that I'm loving. As an elder, I'm loving the learning. I want to get back. So first of all, I want to just emphasize to the audience that please send in questions if you have questions. And there are some questions that have come in. Before I ask these questions, I want to go back to you, Tessa, just to ask you one question, which is you've had the success, a great success in the Netherlands, which is a remarkably progressive nation. I'm sure that not everyone is progressive there, but it is in essence there. How do you see the opportunity of taking that success in litigation for communities in terms of forcing a government to live up to their climate commitment and actually successfully transferring that to other nations? Are there examples of where you think that will work?
Yeah, certainly. I can do you one better, Peter, and I can tell you some examples of where it already has worked. So I think, to give you some contrasting examples to the Netherlands, there have been two successful cases in the last few years, one against the government of Colombia in Latin America and the other one against the government of Pakistan. And the case against the Colombian government was brought by 21 young people, including Indigenous people from the Colombian Amazon. And they brought a case against the government basically saying that the government was failing to stop deforestation of the Colombian Amazon, as it had committed to doing under the UN kind of climate process. And that was a direct threat, not only to their rights, but to the rights of the Amazon, and that the Amazon was a subject of rights as well. And the Colombian Supreme Court, the highest court in the country, agreed with them. And it ordered the government not only to reduce deforestation of the Amazon, as the plaintiffs had requested, but also to create an intergenerational pact for the preservation of the Colombian Amazon, recognizing, really that it was young Indigenous people, young people in Colombia who really have the most to lose from the ongoing degradation of that environment. So that's, I think, one very good example of the way that, these cases, they don't look the same in each country, but they share the same broad objectives and tactics. And maybe I can quickly give you...
We have 8 minutes. Okay.
Yes, I will. Sure. Just quickly, there was a Pakistani farmer who brought a case against the government of Pakistan, arguing that the government wasn't taking the steps that it had promised it would to protect Pakistani farming communities from the impacts of climate change. And the government had already legislated to take those steps, and it just wasn't doing it. It wasn't committing the resources to that problem. And again, that argument was made on the basis that the failure to take those steps was incompatible with the human rights of this particular individual, and the Pakistani, the High Court of Lahore agreed. So, these cases really are unfolding all over the world.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And Nathaniel, one of the questions from the audience has been, if you look at, the question is, what are some of the trends, the demographic trends that you're seeing in non-voting environmentalists?
Great question. Great question. So first, let me just acknowledge that there are obviously a million different ways that someone could define environmentalist. What we do at the Environmental Voter Project, because we're trying to bypass any issue, education, or persuasion whatsoever, is really go for that tip of the spear, which is people who prioritize climate or environmental issues as their number one issue over all others. And when we look at those people, surprise, surprise, they don't look like me. Like, I don't know what stereotypes people are carrying around in their heads about who an environmentalist is, but they're no longer the like white yuppie wearing a Patagonia fleece hopping out of their Prius. Instead, what we're seeing is they are much more likely to be African American or Latinx than white. They are much more likely to make less than $50,000 a year than more. And they are slightly more likely to be young rather than old. And so what is interesting about that is, one, not only does it cut across many of the stereotypes that I think we hold, but two, when you think about voter suppression efforts, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, who are the three groups that are always the subject of voter suppression? Poor people, people of color, and young people. And so another thing that we need to really understand in the environmental movement is, I think we've gotten very good when we talk about environmental justice as seeing many environmental issues as also being civil rights issues. But it goes the other way too. It turns out that because environmentalists are disproportionately people of color and poor people, that actually anytime someone's civil rights are being taken away, chances are you are taking away power from the environmental movement. And so I think it's enormously important for the environmental movement to start understanding our constituency is not what it looked like in the 60s and 70s. And we really, really need to live that on a daily basis.
Great, thank you. And Hindu, a question for you. Do you see a difference in the way that Indigenous women versus Indigenous men experience and react to climate change?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Indigenous communities in general, man, women, and youth, all react to the climate change. We react to build the solution from what we have. We have nothing. We don't have the technology to do it, but we do have our indigenous intelligence who help us to do a lot of work on climate change. And of course, man knowledge and woman knowledge are complementary, but a little bit different. Why it's different? So when I draw like a 3D participatory mapping, where I wanted to put the science knowledge and traditional knowledge of my peoples together to make that the people who are not indigenous to understand our knowledge better. So I have the man who come and draw the knowledge with the big repair. So they put like, they know where is the mountain, where is the rivers, and then now where is the bigger forest, the primary forest. So they understand the big stuff and then the knowledge there. But when the women come, they do have the detailed knowledge in all those spaces man described. Because all those spaces, they can tell you it is the place where I can take water during these months. It is the place where I collect food or where I collect medicine for my kids. So they understand all the detailed knowledge than the man. And it's so evident to see if we talk just one knowledge, we forget about the other one, it's not working. Because as the response are holistic, so the knowledge need to be holistic. And in another way, the traditional knowledge to indigenous peoples, that's one thing, but the response to the climate change. Most of the time, the man, even at the community, they respond during the dry season by saying, honey, you stay back home with the children. I'm going to the big city to find more job and send you back the money. And at that time, those who are left behind, the women and children, they are so innovators. They can get where there is water, where there is food. They take care of the communities, them safety, them security, and all. So that's where they also be creative, and that's also why the indigenous people's knowledge are not just stuck in the box, but it's moving over the change that we are experiencing.
First of all, I want to thank you all. I mean, we have 1 minute. I just got the signal. We have 1 minute left. So I just want to do a quick wrap up. You are all inspiring. You're looking at strategies that are powerful, that they're connected, and they're hopeful. And so So thank you all for doing this. Thank you for kind of pushing the edge, for kind of searching into, the adjacent to what is and trying to figure out new solutions. This is a hope that we actually need to have. Tessa, you talked a little bit about the litigation issue, and I just wanted to tell you that in the work that I've been able to do with Maori people, I'm learning about ocean kinship and actually the rights of nature, the rights of ocean that belong to communities and cultures that we have ignored, but they should have legal standing. And so there's so many opportunities, and we keep on searching for solutions. The three of you are breaking new ground. And I'm really honored to have the chance to actually listen to you and to meet you, and may we get together again. So thank you all so much for what you're doing, and keep on going. We've got a chance. We've got a lot of hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Next session, Peter.
Yeah. The next session is peaceful disruption, emergency funding for raising public awareness, which will begin after a short break at 9:25 Pacific time. Thank you, Hindu.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's really a great pleasure. Thanks so much, Peter. Good to see you.
Wonderful to see you, and wonderful to meet you both. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.